Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today you'll be watching Otto Von Bismarck Part 1, The Wildman Bismarck by Extra History. I am very excited to jump into this series. Bismarck could truly be considered one of the most important politicians of the 19th century, if not one of the most important politicians of modern European history. He is a fascinating and dynamic character, and I'm very excited to learn about him throughout this Extra History series. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Also, if you're interested in the channel and history, then please check out the Discord. It's linked down below. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
You cannot always tell the character of a man from the character of his youth.
That is certainly true in many cases. Perhaps in this one.
1878, the Congress of
Whoa.
Berlin. A graying man.
Yeah, we are way far down. I guess we're jumping in later in his life, and then we'll cut back to the beginning.
Man with a proud walrus mustache stands and says, "Europe today is a powder keg, and the leaders are like men smoking in an arsenal. A single spark will set off an explosion that will consume us all. I cannot tell you when that explosion will occur, but I can tell you where. Some damned foolish thing in the Balkans will set it off."
There you go. This is Bismarck's most famous quote, and a pretty famous quote in general. It's often used to prove that this man knew what he was talking about, show his prophetic powers of seeing into the future, and largely I think that's accurate. This was a very intelligent man. He had a very good read on the European geopolitical situation, and this wasn't the only time he called something that would happen in the future. This is just the most famous example. Also, I'm glad they pointed out his mustache. I think maybe one of the better mustaches of the 19th century, though it's, pretty harsh competition amongst all these European politicians.
1897. A prince in the middle of his life goes to visit the man, the old man now. It is the last time the two will meet, for the younger, Wilhelm II, dismissed this old man years before. But as their visit concludes, the old man issues a warning. He says, "Your Majesty, so long as you have this present officer corps, you can do as you please. But when this is no longer the case, it will be very different for you." Then he says, "The crash will come 20 years after my departure if things go on like this." The old man will die in July of 1898. In November 1918, that prince, Wilhelm II, will abdicate the throne.
Yep, this is another example of Otto von Bismarck's prophetic ability. It's not like he was a seer. He was just a man who understood the political environment, right? And so he could call things like this. Now, don't overblow it. It's not like he could see everything that was going to happen, but this was a pretty intelligent man who understood what he was talking about. Also, from that interaction, you can see, look, Bismarck was someone who absolutely respected royal authority, but as you saw from that interaction, he was willing to stand up to royal authority. He was willing to speak his mind and push for what he felt was the best course of action. That is someone with a lot of power and a lot of respect in their own right.
Having lost the backing of his army in the disaster that was the First World War, Bismarck's prediction was off by only 4 months.
Not bad.
He was the mind that would use Europe for a chessboard and redraw the map forever. But this was something that few could see in his youth. Otto's time in grade school was middling, and we know little of his early teenage years. But at 17, when he enters college, we begin to get a picture of the man.
Yes. Alright, I see what they're doing. So they brought us in with Bismarck in his later years, sort of established his credentials as this very wise, intelligent figure who really understood the inner workings of European politics, and now we're going back to his wild younger years.
6 feet of dashing, with a tousled mane of copper blonde hair, often seen walking not with a walking stick, but with a twisted staff of iron. He cut a dashing figure. Classes
Yes.
weren't really for him. He stopped going almost immediately, preferring Byron and Walter Scott as tutors to any other. He was quick with words and equally quick to a challenge. He got himself into more than one duel per month while he was
Oh
at
my
his first
God.
university, engaging in 26 contests of honor and being wounded only once.
Jesus. It was dangerous to be a loudmouth back then. I don't think I could have made it. The amount of duels I would have been challenged to. I'm like, look, I'm willing to speak my mind, but not if it's going to put my life at risk. Bismarck had no such concern. So they're doing a bit of contrast here, juxtaposition, saying, he was this wise old man, and look how wild he was. And that is true. He was a very wild young man. He was perhaps more focused on other pursuits than he was his studies, but, he was an educated individual. He was from the German elite class, the Prussian elite Junker class, as they're called, these land-owning aristocrats. So he was of, quote-unquote, good stock. He had a good education, and I do think something that he would hold for the rest of his life is the dynamism. As you can see here, he was a dynamic young man. He would remain dynamic throughout the entirety of his life, maybe not in the same way, but in one way or another.
To his dying day, he would insist that he was only wounded because his opponent's rapier broke. He consumed monumental amounts of alcohol, discovered a profound, if not so profound, love of the fairer sex, and managed to rack up a small mountain of debts. Most intriguing of all, though, he got himself cast as a character named Otto Von Bismarck when his roommate wrote a novel about their wild college life. By the way, this man, who was quite aptly named Motley, would soon become a historian of some note.
I believe he was an American writer.
And one of the diplomats who kept Europe from siding with the Confederacy in the American Civil War. Anyway,
not bad.
That wild college life of theirs eventually caught up to Otto, and he moved to Berlin both to attend law school and to dodge the consequences of his roguish ways. Still rooming with Motley, he never once went to class while in law school. But when graduation time drew near, he hired what is politely known as a crammer at the last minute, and managed to pass the exam to become a practitioner of law. And all the while, he read voraciously. Not only romantic poets, but also history, economics, and philosophy. Although not the heady abstractions of Hegel or Kant that were...
He's like, I am not going to be reading Kant or Hegel. Too difficult. I don't find Kant that bad, but Hegel, Jesus Christ. I wouldn't want to sit through that either, frankly. Though, of course, very important philosophers, both of them. And we can see, and we see this with a lot of these sort of dynamic characters throughout history. Bismarck, though he was ultimately successful in his education, he was far more focused on his own pursuits, even his own academic pursuits, over whatever he was supposed to be doing. His official classwork, studying for exams. No, he would rather read, whatever he wanted to read. As you could see, a very wide selection of authors and texts.
The rage at the time. By the time he left law school, he felt ready for a career in the diplomatic service. Unfortunately, the foreign minister did not hold a high opinion of the diplomatic abilities of Prussian nobility, and preferred to hire from without. So, rather than being assigned some glorious foreign posting, Bismarck was soon sent to Aachen, a territory taken from the French in the Napoleonic Wars, and he was given the job of figuring out how to better integrate it into Prussia. This task never really captured his interest. It was the English he was far more interested in. For Aachen had become a
some particular English.
popular spa and vacation spot for the English gentry, and, more notably, their daughters.
There you go.
Unfortunately, he was soon canned after he overstayed a river trip with one of these daughters by 3 months. It took...
He was a bit of a fiend, as they have said. He got himself into a bit of trouble, by, as they put it, pursuing the fairer sex. Yes, he was interested not particularly in the English, but in those English daughters who were there, getting himself into some trouble.
Some significant family influence to get this self-designated leave quietly swept under the rug, and Otto was soon involuntarily volunteered for the army. But before even his year of mandatory service was done, his mother took ill and died. This tragedy finally made his path clear. His father had never been good at managing anything, and his mother had run their more unruly estates. With her passing, Otto would take over this duty. A gentleman farmer's life for him.
Yeah, and what I will say is that, I did make the point that Bismarck was dynamic throughout his life, but I don't want to give you the idea that he didn't change. He was definitely wilder in his younger years. He was not held down by responsibility. As you can see, he didn't take his responsibilities very seriously, and so at some point, I think starting here, that began to change, and I mean, this is a common thing in a lot of people's lives. As he began to grow up a little bit, he was faced with some serious life changes, some serious responsibilities, family responsibilities. He started to pick up the slack, really focus on getting stuff done.
He was completely unprepared for this task, but he did still have his secret weapon, the one expedient that had carried him through every challenge life dealt him: cramming. So as his military service wrapped up, he devoured books on agricultural science, estate management, and economics. He even managed to get himself into a soil chemistry course at a nearby agricultural institute.
And by the way, when we talk about, running the family farm, remember, he is a member of the Prussian Junker nobility. He's not like a small-holding yeoman running his own farm. When they say running the farm, I mean, he might have done some physical labor, probably not. He was directing people to do things. I just want to clarify the picture that they're painting here.
Armed with this knowledge, he set to his task with vigor. And so, even as the agricultural markets of Northern Europe collapsed around him, his estate grew in value, and his diligence was matched only by his eccentricity. He became known for unpredictable behavior, like marking his entrance into a neighbor's house by firing a pistol into their ceiling, or releasing foxes into people's drawing rooms. He earned the nickname the Wildman Bismarck from the locals, and, as always, from the local ladies as well. But this wild man treated his laborers well, much better than their ceilings and drawing rooms anyway, and he further devoted himself to his studies, diving deep into history, poetry, English politics, and even philosophy.
And I think that, I don't know that this image of the Wildman Bismarck was fake. I think he absolutely was a wild man, but I think it could obscure sort of his real nature. People would see him as eccentricities, his charm, his wild nature, and they would think, well, that's a wild man. But as you can see, he was a very intelligent individual. He was well-read, well-educated, and he could really diligently devote himself to any sort of issue or responsibility if he wanted to. So, don't let the charm and the sparkle of his image blind you to the kind of guy he really was, even at this point.
Though he did still have a preference for Spinoza over the German philosophers that were informing many of his more liberal colleagues' thoughts at the time. All of this, and perhaps age, began to refine him, to smooth out his roughest edges.
Yeah.
And though country life weighed heavy on him, in many ways he was well suited for it. It looked as though the life of a country squire was to be his calling. Over time, he settled in.
A country squire, a country lord, just to reiterate that. And yeah, his sharp edges got rounded off a little bit. Like I said, he was not as wild throughout his entire life, but I do think that dynamism remained. He was someone who was willing to do what it took to achieve his goals, even if it meant sort of going out of his way or resorting to solutions that others might not resort to.
Made friends. He even married a woman who seemed wholly unsuited to him. A quiet, devout woman with no interest in politics or English poetry. But she made him quite happy. In fact, he adopted her religion, pietism, to marry her. And such is the strange character of Bismarck that he did so earnestly, or at least he adopted the parts of her faith which he earnestly found compelling. But her father doubted that Otto was sincere in his conversion. This was the wild man Bismarck, after all. But Bismarck had a plan. Bismarck always has a plan.
Yes,
he wrote his
he
beloved
does.
father
Yes,
a
he
letter
does.
detailing his path to finding faith. And when the man still hesitated, Bismarck, being Bismarck, seized the moment, tore all the way across Pomerania in the middle of winter, and showed up at the man's estate to convince him in person. When Bismarck returned...
Yeah, I will say this is a very Bismarckian way of proving the truth of your conversion, even though, of course, that is a highly personal thing. No one can know what's going on in your head and heart. He says, all right, I've laid out a plan. I'm going to do all these things to prove it to you. We'll go step by step. Just a very Bismarck way of going about this Well, what is a personal issue, basically?
Returned from this excursion, he found on his desk a letter. It was an invitation to take charge of running the dikes on the Elbe. It may not seem like much, but it was an official position. His time in the doghouse with the government might be over.
There you go. He finally got another opportunity. If we remember, he sort of messed it up last time by chasing English women around and neglecting his duties, but he's now getting another chance to prove himself.
So he attacked the work. Then, in 1847, something monumental happened. The King of Prussia called a parliament. For the first time, Prussians would get together, debate, and vote on things. But Otto's wedding date was near, and besides, he hated Berlin, and he was a staunch conservative, believing in the power of the monarchy.
Yeah, this is some interesting stuff. We're hitting upon a really critical time in European history. We're about to hit 1848. And Bismarck, he is a conservative amongst all of this emerging liberalism and, soon socialism. He's a conservative. He's a royalist. I think that is one of the more interesting things about him, or maybe one of the things that draws people to Bismarck, is that, he is this traditional conservative type, but he is so dynamic, and he's willing to do things that other conservatives are not in order to maintain power, maintain his position, and achieve his goals. So he's a really fascinating character. And you got to remember, at this point, I believe he was born around 1815. Now we're in the 1840s. He's already in his 30s. He's got a while to go, of course. I'm not saying that he's getting old, but, he's already lived a bit of life. He's had a lot of experiences. He's gotten married. He's run a farm. He's done a lot of different things. So he's got a lot of experience under his belt already.
At a time when liberalism and democracy were in vogue, even the idea of a parliament grated against his royalist leanings. For though this was a summoned rather than an elected parliament, it was almost certainly going to be used to push for a proper elected parliament.
Yes, and Bismarck, in what was becoming anachronistic even at this time, truly believed in this sort of divine right monarchy. Now, look, there were still a lot of royalists at this time, especially amongst the elites, amongst the aristocratic Junker class. I'm not saying those beliefs were unpopular, but momentum was with the liberals. It was moving in that direction. A lot of people were liberal to some capacity. Maybe they didn't believe in democracy, but maybe they believed in a constitutional monarchy, on some limits on the monarchy's power. Bismarck was firmly conservative in a world that was becoming more and more liberal. I think that's one of the things that makes him an interesting character, because even though he's opposed to a lot of these changes, he has to navigate through them throughout his entire career.
One which, by its very nature, must take its power from the royal government. So he was reluctant to go. Even if he were to be summoned, he might not. But then fate turned. He received another letter. An acquaintance, whose good graces he wanted to stay in, had suddenly fallen ill, and now requested that Otto take up his post as representative of the Prussian Saxon nobility. This request made no sense, as technically Otto was not part of the Prussian Saxon nobility. His estates were all either in Altmark or Pomerania. But never mind that, he couldn't turn down such an important request. So he made his way to the United Diet, where a push for a true parliament was already in session.
And now we have Bismarck in an interesting situation, and I always think this dynamic is sort of fascinating. He is now participating in this parliament which is pushing for more democratic elements, and yet he is completely opposed to the whole business. The idea of someone participating in an institution that they wholly disagree with or want to get rid of, now that's an interesting dynamic, and that's a dynamic we see often with these conservative types when we're talking about, parliaments popping up or constitutions, and then you have these elite aristocrat conservatives in positions, but they are completely opposed to this whole business, and so they try to stifle any further democratic progress. Bismarck is certainly opposed to all of this, but like I said, he is a unique character. He acts a little differently than you might expect at times.
Pro-democratic speeches were given. One man got up and declared that the Prussian people had only thrown back Napoleon because they were promised a constitution. This was too much. Bismarck stood and responded that the Prussian people had thrown back Napoleon for Prussia. Did the man really think that Prussians wouldn't have stood up against an invader without being promised a piece of paper? The hall erupted in boos. People shouted and stamped. The place was chaos. But Bismarck, being Bismarck, just picked up a newspaper and began to leisurely read through it.
Yeah, you could imagine that the rest of the parliament would not have loved the point he was making. But, by serving in parliament, this is how Bismarck builds his reputation. And he builds his reputation as a firmly conservative, but very dynamic and charismatic speaker with a strong gift for rhetoric. He slowly, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but over time, he starts to become one of the strongest voices of the conservative movement, one of the most persuasive voices of the conservative movement.
Until they were quite done. And then he finished his speech. And in that moment, Bismarck, the country squire, became Bismarck, the statesman.
Yes. Yes, he did, and he would become one of the most important statesmen of modern European history. All right, that was episode 1 of Otto von Bismarck by Extra History. I think Bismarck is a truly fascinating character. We got to see his early life into his early political career in this episode. An interesting setup from this point onwards. Now we get to see the fascinating career that he worked his way through, all of the different things he did. I'm excited to get to the next episode. If you guys enjoyed this one, then once again, please check out the Patreon. It's linked down below. And leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, all of that good stuff. Anyway, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.